Daughters given as sacred vessels. Consanguineous blood cults. This is the story of America's most twisted religious sect. Hidden deep within Appalachia's remote valleys, tucked far from mainstream society's watchful gaze, one of the nation's darkest religious secrets festered across multiple decades. What follows is the shocking true account of the Children of Eden, a clandestine religious movement established in 1921 that practiced one of the most disturbing forms of genetic isolation ever recorded on American soil. The year 1972 marked when authorities first discovered this isolated community, nestled within the mist-shrouded mountains of eastern Tennessee. Their findings would shock even the most hardened investigators. A religious compound where daughters were systematically offered as sacred vessels to their own blood relatives, all in service of preserving what members called the divine bloodline. For nearly 50 years, the Children of Eden existed in complete isolation. They remained hidden within a lush valley, reachable only by a single dirt road that vanished into dense forest. Their compound featured 12 modest wooden homes arranged in a circle around a central meeting hall. From a distance, it appeared eerily unremarkable. Yet behind those closed doors, the community practiced rituals that violated both legal and natural order. The cult was established by Isaiah Shepard, a charismatic former Methodist preacher who broke from mainstream religion in 1921 after claiming divine revelations about humanity's corrupted bloodlines. Shepard preached that most humans had been tainted through interbreeding with lesser races. Only through strict bloodline purity, he insisted, could humanity return to its divine origins. The sacred bloodline must remain unsullied, read Shepard's manifesto, recovered from the community years later. As in the days of old when the patriarchs took their kin as wives, so must we preserve what remains of Eden's purity in our veins. By the time authorities discovered the compound in 1972, 3 generations had lived according to Shepard's disturbing doctrine. Isaiah himself died in 1965, but his son Abraham perpetuated the practice. He took not only his first cousin as primary wife, but eventually claimed 3 of his own nieces as additional spiritual consorts. The discovery came when Eliza Shepard, a 16-year-old girl born within the cult, managed to escape after learning she would be consecrated as wife to her 42-year-old uncle in an upcoming ceremony. Bruised and exhausted, she stumbled into a gas station 20 miles from the compound, begging the attendant to summon police. "They're going to give me to my uncle," she told the responding officer, her voice barely above a whisper. "They say my blood is pure enough now that I've become a woman. There are others like me. So many others." What investigators uncovered at the compound defied comprehension. Detailed genealogical charts covered the walls of the central meeting hall, intricate lines connecting family members across generations. Marginal notes calculated blood purity percentages and identified optimal pairings to maximize what the cult called divine essence. The Children of Eden had developed their own theology, a twisted amalgamation of Old Testament references, pseudoscientific eugenics, and Shepard's personal delusions. They believed Adam and Eve's original sin wasn't eating the forbidden fruit, but diluting their perfect bloodline through mating with corrupted beings outside Eden. The cult's isolation protected its practices for decades. With no outside contact, children born into the community knew nothing of the wider world or its laws. They were taught that their way of life wasn't merely normal, but divinely mandated. Women and girls were told their highest purpose was serving as sacred vessels for continuing the pure bloodline. Medical examinations of cult members revealed the horrifying consequences of generations of consanguinity. Children displayed distinctive facial abnormalities, intellectual disabilities, and a range of genetic disorders. One medical report noted that among the 14 children under age 10 in the community, 11 showed symptoms consistent with recessive genetic conditions. The most heartbreaking cases involved the youngest generation, children suffering from severe developmental issues, heart defects, and rare metabolic disorders. 6-year-old Sarah Shepard could neither walk nor speak, while 8-year-old twins Jacob and Esau required constant care due to a rare genetic disorder causing progressive blindness and seizures. Dr. Margaret Reynolds, who examined many of the children, later testified, "What I witnessed was a preventable tragedy. These children's suffering resulted directly from generations of consanguineous mating. The genetic conditions I observed would be extremely rare in the general population, yet appeared with shocking frequency in this isolated group. Beyond physical consequences, the psychological impact on community members ran deep. Women raised to believe their only value lay in reproductive capacity showed signs of severe depression and trauma. Children raised within this enclosed system struggled to comprehend that their upbringing had been anything but normal. "They told us we were special," recalled former member Ruth Shepard in a later interview. "That we were the last pure humans, and the outside world was filled with corrupted beings who would taint our blood. We believed it because we'd never known anything different." The compound raid led to immediate arrests of the community's male leaders, including Abraham Shepard and his 4 brothers, all of whom had taken relatives as wives. Women and children were temporarily placed in protective custody while authorities determined how best to integrate them into mainstream society. Check now if you're subscribed to this channel. You won't want to miss our upcoming investigation into America's most isolated communities and the disturbing practices that flourish behind closed doors. The Children of Eden's origins trace back to early 20th century America's religious ferment. Isaiah Shepard began his career as a respected Methodist minister in rural Kentucky, known for fiery sermons and extensive scripture knowledge. But by 1918, his teachings had drifted from orthodoxy. Journals recovered from the compound revealed Shepard's gradual descent into obsession with bloodlines and purity. The triggering event appeared to be a series of infant deaths within his own family. 3 of his grandchildren died from congenital disorders between 1917 and 1919, leading him to develop theories about blood corruption and genetic purity. "The Lord has shown me why our children perish," he wrote in a journal entry dated March 12, 1919. "We have strayed from the ancient ways, allowing our sacred blood to mix with those of lesser origin. The patriarchs knew to keep their lineages pure. Abraham took his half-sister Sarah as wife, and Isaac and Jacob chose from among their kin. This was not sin, but divine wisdom." By 1920, Shepard had been removed from his Methodist Church position after preaching increasingly controversial sermons about racial purity and divine bloodlines. Undeterred, he gathered a small group of devoted followers, primarily extended family members, and purchased 200 acres of remote land in eastern Tennessee. The original community consisted of just 17 people: Isaiah, his wife Martha, their 5 children, and several cousins and in-laws. For the first decade, the community functioned primarily as an isolated religious commune, largely self-sufficient but still maintaining occasional contact with neighboring towns. The shift toward extreme isolation and consanguineous practices appears to have intensified after Martha's death in 1932. Isaiah, then 52, took his deceased wife's younger sister as his new bride, a practice that, while unusual, wasn't entirely unheard of in rural communities of the time. But by 1935, he had also claimed his own niece as a spiritual wife, officially beginning the cult's practice of close consanguineous unions. A handwritten manifesto found in the compound, titled The Restoration of Eden's Bloodline, outlined Shepard's disturbing theology in detail. In it, he claimed to have received divine revelation that humanity had been created perfect but had degraded through interbreeding with lesser races that he claimed existed outside the Garden of Eden. The manifesto stated, the sons of Adam were commanded to preserve their divine essence by taking only daughters of pure lineage as wives. When they disobeyed and took wives from corrupted bloodlines, the Great Flood came as purification. Noah and his family alone preserved the sacred blood. But even this has now been diluted through centuries of impure unions. Shepard believed that only through careful intermarriage among proven pure bloodlines could humanity hope to restore its divine nature. He established elaborate rules for determining appropriate matches, requiring detailed genealogical records and even developing a primitive understanding of genetic inheritance decades before DNA was understood by mainstream science. Most disturbingly, Shepard instituted the practice of consecration, a ceremony in which girls who had reached puberty were evaluated for blood purity and then assigned as wives to men within the community who would best strengthen the sacred lineage. These unions were almost always between close relatives, uncles and nieces, first cousins, and occasionally even half-siblings. By the 1950s, the Children of Eden had completely severed ties with the outside world. They produced their own food, made their own clothing, and delivered their own babies. Children born into the community were taught that the outside world was corrupt and dangerous. They were shown no newspapers, allowed no radios, and received education only from community elders who taught from specially prepared texts reinforcing the cult's worldview. When Isaiah died in 1965, leadership passed to his eldest son, Abraham, who not only continued the practices but intensified them. During Abraham's leadership, blood purity evaluation became even more central to community life. Girls as young as 12 were subjected to examinations determining their divine essence level and assigned marriages accordingly. Abraham developed a complex pseudoscientific system for calculating what he called essence percentages, using family lineages to estimate how pure each community member's bloodline remained. Those with highest purity were considered most valuable for breeding and were often claimed by Abraham himself or his brothers. Former member Matthew Shepard, who escaped the cult in 1968 at age 19, later described the atmosphere of constant evaluation. From our earliest days, we were measured and assessed. The girls especially were watched like prized cattle. They'd examine their features, the shape of their faces, even the pattern of their fingerprints. Everything was recorded in the great books, and based on those records, they decide who would be paired with whom. Matthew's escape hadn't triggered the same investigation as Eliza's would years later. As a young man deemed less pure due to slight physical asymmetry in his features, he had been assigned menial labor rather than a wife. When he fled to a nearby town and attempted to report the community's practices, local authorities dismissed his claims as the ravings of a troubled youth. It would take Eliza's escape and the testimony of a young woman to finally bring attention to the cult. As investigators pieced together the community structure following the 1972 raid, they discovered a society organized entirely around preserving and enhancing what members called the sacred bloodline. Every aspect of daily life, from food preparation to sleeping arrangements, was determined by one standing in the blood purity hierarchy. Those deemed most pure received better food, more comfortable living quarters, and greater authority. Those considered less pure, often children exhibiting signs of genetic disorders resulting from generations of inbreeding, were treated as servants or worse, sometimes confined to Spartan quarters on the compound's edges. Most disturbing was the discovery of the Shepherd Bloodline Bible, a massive tome containing generations of genealogical records, purity calculations, and disturbing theological justifications for the community's practices. The document revealed that Abraham had been planning even more extreme measures to accelerate purification, including plans to pair his own daughter with her brother once both reached puberty. For the 47 women and children rescued from the compound, the outside world represented a bewildering new reality. Many children had never seen television, eaten in a restaurant, or interacted with anyone outside their community. The women, particularly those born into the cult, struggled to understand that the life they had known was considered aberrant by mainstream society. By 1973, criminal cases against the male leaders of the Children of Eden had begun moving through the Tennessee court system. Abraham Shepard and his brothers faced numerous charges including child endangerment, statutory assault, and incest. The trials drew national attention, with newspapers across the country reporting on the shocking practices of the isolated cult. The most heart-wrenching testimony came from women and older girls who had been consecrated as wives within the community. 23-year-old Naomi Shepard, who had been married to her uncle at age 14, described the psychological conditioning that made such arrangements seem normal to those raised in the cult. From my earliest memories, I was taught that my purpose was to carry on the sacred bloodline, she testified. We were shown portraits of the patriarchs from the Bible and told how they had taken their kinswomen as wives to preserve divine purity. I believed it was not only normal but holy. If you've been affected by the disturbing truth of this story, please leave a comment saying, "Humanity deserves better than this." Your voice matters in bringing attention to these hidden tragedies. The trials revealed the extensive measures the cult had taken to justify their practices. The community had developed their own educational materials, religious texts, and social structures, all designed to normalize consanguineous relationships and prevent members from questioning the leader's authority. Children were taught modified Bible stories emphasizing instances of kinship marriages in the Old Testament while omitting later prohibitions against such practices. They were shown carefully selected examples from royal families throughout history who had practiced consanguineous marriages to keep bloodlines pure, particularly the Egyptian pharaohs and European royal houses. Most insidiously, they were taught a distorted version of genetics claiming certain traits could only be preserved through unions between blood relatives. Children who exhibited genetic disorders or disabilities were presented as examples of what happened when divine bloodlines were corrupted, rather than recognized as the actual results of inbreeding. Dr. James Richardson, a psychologist who worked with the cult survivors, later wrote, "The genius of the Children of Eden's indoctrination was its totality. By controlling every aspect of information from birth, they created a closed epistemic system where their practices appeared not only normal but divinely ordained." For children raised in such an environment, the outside world's moral standard seemed like the aberration. For the survivors, integration into mainstream society proved extraordinarily difficult. Beyond psychological adjustments, many faced severe health challenges resulting from generations of consanguinity. The genetic disorders present in the community ranged from relatively mild conditions like polydactyly to severe disabilities requiring lifetime care. Rebecca Shepherd, who was 16 when rescued from the compound, suffered from a rare metabolic disorder causing progressive damage to her nervous system. Doctors determined the condition resulted from inheriting recessive genes from both parents who were first cousins. Though treatment improved her quality of life, she would require medical care for the remainder of her days. The children bore the heaviest burden of the cult's practices, wrote Dr. Eleanor Michaels, who oversaw medical care for many younger survivors. Many exhibited genetic conditions so rare they appear in medical literature at rates of 1 in millions. Yet we found multiple cases within this single community. The clustering of these disorders provides stark evidence of the biological consequences of sustained consanguinity. Beyond physical and psychological impacts on survivors, the case raised difficult questions for social service systems attempting to integrate them into society. Many children had no birth certificates or official records. Family relationships were so tangled that determining legal guardianship for minors proved nearly impossible in some cases. Most challenging were questions about keeping families together. In many instances, mothers had themselves been victims of the cult's practices, but remained deeply bonded with children who were products of consanguineous unions. Separating these families risked causing additional trauma, yet maintaining them meant navigating complex psychological and social terrain. Social worker Catherine Hayes, who worked closely with several survivor families, described the dilemma. These women were simultaneously victims and perpetrators, raised in a system that gave them no choice but to participate, yet now responsible for children born of that system. Our goal became helping them understand the harm of the practices they'd been raised with while supporting their transition to healthy family relationships. For many survivors, the outside world's reaction to their story compounded their trauma. Media coverage often sensationalized the case with headlines focusing on lurid details rather than the complex social and psychological factors enabling the cult to persist for decades. Those who chose to speak publicly about their experiences faced stigma and misunderstanding. People struggled to comprehend how anyone could participate in or tolerate such practices, failing to understand the totality of isolation and indoctrination that had characterized life in the compound. Hannah Shepherd, who had been 12 when removed from the community, later reflected on this challenge. People would ask, "How could you not know it was wrong?" But imagine never seeing another way of life, never meeting anyone who lived differently, never even hearing that there were other possibilities. Our world was the only world we knew. By 1975, special educational programs had been established for younger survivors, designed to address both academic gaps and the unique psychological needs of children raised in the cult. These programs focused on gradual integration, providing safe spaces where children could learn about mainstream society while processing their experiences. For adult survivors, integration took different forms. Some chose to maintain connections with each other, finding comfort in shared experiences that outsiders could never fully understand. Others preferred complete breaks with the past, relocating to distant areas and rarely speaking of their upbringing. Some found meaning in educating others about the dangers of isolation and extremism. Rachel Shepherd, who had been 18 when rescued, eventually became an advocate for cult awareness and education. After completing her GED and attending college, she devoted her career to helping other survivors of high-control religious groups. "What happened to us could happen anywhere. Isolation and unquestioned authority are allowed to flourish," she told an audience during a 1982 conference on religious extremism. "The greatest protection against such abuses is connection, ensuring that no community exists entirely outside the awareness of broader society." The legal aftermath of the Children of Eden case led to significant changes in how Tennessee authorities monitored isolated religious communities. New protocols were established for periodic welfare checks on children in remote areas, and additional training was provided to rural school officials to recognize signs of potential abuse in isolated groups. For the survivors themselves, healing would be a lifelong journey. Many continued struggling with health issues, psychological trauma, and questions of identity well into adulthood. Yet many also found remarkable resilience, building new lives and families based on healthier foundations. By the early 1980s, most criminal cases against the Children of Eden's leadership had concluded. Abraham Shepard received a 30-year sentence for multiple counts of assault and incest, while his brothers received sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years. The cult's elaborate compound had been abandoned, eventually reclaimed by surrounding forest until little remained but weathered foundations and overgrown paths. But the story of the Children of Eden didn't end with criminal convictions. For geneticists and medical researchers, the community represented a rare case study in the effects of sustained consanguinity in an isolated population. With consent from adult survivors, several research institutions began studying the unusual concentration of genetic disorders found among former cult members. Dr. Thomas Harrison, a geneticist at Vanderbilt University who led one such study, published his findings in 1983. The Children of Eden community represents one of the most extreme documented cases of sustained consanguineous breeding in recent American history. The genetic consequences observed in survivors provide compelling evidence of the biological mechanisms behind prohibitions against close-kin marriages found across human cultures. The research identified 27 distinct genetic disorders among the survivor population, an extraordinary number for a community that had numbered fewer than 100 members at its peak. Most were autosomal recessive conditions that normally occur only when a child inherits the same rare genetic mutation from both parents, something far more likely when those parents share recent ancestors. Among the conditions documented were multiple cases of phenylketonuria, a metabolic disorder causing intellectual disability if untreated, a rare form of congenital heart defect found in 6 children from different families, an unusual variant of Usher syndrome causing both deafness and progressive blindness, several cases of Ellis-Van Creveld syndrome causing dwarfism and polydactyly, and multiple instances of severe combined immunodeficiency leaving children vulnerable to infections. "What makes this case particularly significant," wrote Dr. Harrison, "is that we can trace specific genetic mutations through the community's meticulously kept genealogical records. This allows us to observe precisely how recessive conditions became concentrated through generations of consanguineous mating. The genetic consequences extended beyond immediately observable disorders." Follow-up studies in the 1990s found that survivors had significantly higher rates of miscarriage, infant mortality, and reduced fertility compared to the general population, all consistent with genetic damage accumulated through generations of inbreeding. For the survivors themselves, these findings carried profound implications. Many faced difficult decisions about whether to have children of their own, knowing they might carry recessive genes causing serious disorders if they partnered with someone sharing similar ancestry. Genetic counseling became an essential service for survivors who chose to start families. Through careful screening and partner selection, many were able to have healthy children, gradually diluting the concentration of harmful recessive genes through unions with unrelated partners. Others chose adoption or decided not to have children at all, decisions often influenced by their own health challenges or concerns about perpetuating genetic disorders. These deeply personal choices reflected the long shadow cast by the cult's practices, affecting life decisions decades after its dissolution. Beyond medical consequences, survivors continued grappling with psychological and social challenges. Many struggled with forming healthy intimate relationships, their understanding of family bonds distorted by their upbringing. Trust came slowly, if at all, particularly for those directly victimized through forced marriages. Support groups specifically for Children of Eden survivors emerged in the late 1970s, providing rare spaces where they could speak openly about their experiences without judgment. These groups became crucial resources for many, offering both practical advice for navigating the outside world and emotional support from those who truly understood their unique circumstances. Martha Shepard, who had been 14 when rescued from the compound, described these groups as her lifeline. "Nowhere else could I talk about what it was like to discover that your family wasn't normal, that the man you called father was also your cousin, that your mother was your father's niece. These weren't things I could explain to friends or colleagues. Only others who had lived it could truly understand." By the 1990s, enough time had passed that some survivors felt ready to share their stories more publicly, hoping to educate others about the dangers of isolated extremist groups. Several published memoirs, while others participated in documentaries exploring the history of the Children of Eden and its aftermath. These accounts revealed the remarkable diversity of survivor experiences and coping mechanisms. Some had embraced conventional religious communities, finding healing and healthier expressions of spirituality. Others rejected religion entirely, viewing any form of faith with deep suspicion after their experiences. Some maintained contact with parents or siblings despite the complicated nature of those relationships, working through family therapy to establish healthier boundaries. Others made complete breaks, legally changing their names and creating entirely new identities separate from their past. Regardless of their individual paths, virtually all survivors emphasized the importance of education and awareness in preventing similar situations. They advocated for greater attention to isolated communities and better training for educators, healthcare providers, and law enforcement in recognizing warning signs of abuse in closed religious groups. Their advocacy contributed to significant changes in how authorities approached isolated religious communities throughout the 1980s and 1990s. While respecting constitutional protections for religious freedom, agencies developed more nuanced approaches to monitoring potential abuse without unnecessarily intruding on legitimate religious practices. Educational outreach programs were developed specifically for rural communities where isolation might enable abusive practices to continue undetected. These programs emphasize reporting mechanisms and warning signs while respecting diverse religious traditions and lifestyles. For researchers in fields beyond medicine, the Children of Eden case provided valuable insights into how extremist ideologies develop and sustain themselves. Sociologists, psychologists, and religious studies scholars analyzed the cult's evolution from a relatively mainstream religious group into an isolated community practicing extreme consanguinity. Dr. Rebecca Mitchell, a sociologist who studied the group extensively, identified several factors enabling the cult's practices to continue for decades. First was geographic isolation, which limited outside observation. Second was informational isolation, controlling what members knew about the outside world. Third was the gradual normalization of increasingly extreme practices, each step building on the last. And finally there was the creation of a comprehensive worldview that made their practices appear not only acceptable but divinely mandated. This analysis informed approaches to other isolated religious groups, helping authorities distinguish between communities that simply preferred separation from mainstream society and those where isolation enabled harmful practices. The goal became protecting vulnerable members while respecting legitimate religious freedoms, a delicate balance that continues to challenge legal and social service systems today. For the Children of Eden survivors, perhaps the most remarkable outcome was their ability to build meaningful lives despite their traumatic beginnings. Many achieved significant educational and professional accomplishments despite having started with virtually no formal education. Others found purpose in family life, creating the healthy, loving homes they themselves had been denied. By 2025, more than 50 years have passed since the Children of Eden compound was discovered and its members integrated into society. Most original adult members have now passed away, including all leadership who received criminal sentences. The survivors who were children at the time of the raid are now in their 60s and 70s, many with grandchildren of their own. The physical location of the compound has been reclaimed entirely by nature. Few traces remain of the community that once lived there in isolation, practicing its disturbing theology of blood purity. Local residents know the general area as a place with a dark history, but exact locations have been lost to time and deliberate obscurity. Yet the legacy of the Children of Eden continues in multiple dimensions, through ongoing medical research, through changed institutional practices, and most significantly through the lives of survivors and their descendants. The genetic legacy has been the most scientifically significant. The longitudinal studies initiated in the 1980s have now tracked 3 generations, the original survivors, their children, and in many cases their grandchildren. These studies have provided invaluable data on how genetic disorders are inherited and how quickly genetic health can be restored when consanguinity ends. Dr. Jennifer Lawrence, current director of the Children of Eden Genetic Legacy Project at the University of Tennessee, summarizes the findings. What we've observed is both concerning and hopeful. The first generation, those directly from the compound, showed extraordinarily high rates of genetic disorders. The second generation, born to survivors who partnered with unrelated individuals, showed marked improvement but still elevated rates of certain conditions. By the third generation, most genetic markers have returned to frequencies consistent with the general population. This research has contributed significantly to the broader field of genetic counseling, providing concrete evidence for advising individuals from consanguineous backgrounds. It has also informed public health approaches in communities worldwide where cousin marriages remain common cultural practices, helping to educate about risks while respecting cultural traditions. Beyond the medical domain, the Children of Eden case continues to influence how authorities approach isolated religious communities. The lessons learned have been incorporated into training for law enforcement, social workers, and educators across the United States. The key principle that emerged, maintaining awareness without unnecessary intrusion, has helped authorities strike a more effective balance between protecting vulnerable individuals and respecting religious freedom. Regular welfare checks, educational requirements for children, and unobtrusive monitoring have become standard practices for addressing potential concerns in isolated groups. But the most profound legacy lies in the lives of the survivors themselves and the remarkable resilience they have demonstrated. Despite beginnings marked by isolation, indoctrination, and genetic challenges, many have built lives of extraordinary achievement and meaning. Eliza Shepard, whose escape triggered the original investigation, eventually earned a doctorate in psychology and established a specialized treatment center for survivors of high-control religious groups. Now in her late 60s, she continues to consult with law enforcement and social service agencies on approaches to isolated communities. What happened to us was preventable, she notes in a recent interview. Not through aggressive government intervention, but through maintaining basic connections between all communities and mainstream society. Complete isolation is the soil in which abuse flourishes. Maintaining some threads of connection through education, healthcare, or community interactions provides essential protection. Other survivors found different paths to healing and purpose. James Shepard, who was 10 when removed from the compound, became a geneticist directly inspired by the disorders he witnessed in his own community. His research on recessive genetic conditions has helped develop screening protocols now used worldwide. Ruth Shepard, who struggled with severe health issues resulting from her parents' consanguineous union, became an advocate for disability rights. Unable to have children of her own due to her conditions, she fostered over 20 children during her lifetime, providing stable, loving homes for those who, like herself, had experienced difficult beginnings. For many survivors, the most meaningful achievement has been establishing healthy family patterns that contrast sharply with their upbringing. They have raised children with knowledge of their heritage, but free from its harmful practices, creating a new generation unbound by the cult's legacy. Sarah Carpenter, née Shepard, who was just 6 when rescued from the compound, reflects on this accomplishment. Breaking intergenerational cycles is perhaps the hardest work humans can do. Many of us had no models for healthy family life, no examples of normal parent-child relationships. We had to learn these things as adults, often through therapy, support groups, and sheer determination not to repeat the patterns we were raised with. This determination has largely succeeded. Follow-up studies with the children and grandchildren of survivors show remarkably healthy psychological profiles, with rates of family stability, educational achievement, and mental health comparable to or exceeding national averages. The feared transmission of trauma to subsequent generations has largely been prevented through conscious intervention and support. The story of the Children of Eden serves as both warning and inspiration, a testament to how isolated extremism can enable terrible abuses, but also to the extraordinary human capacity for healing and transformation. From the darkest beginnings, survivors created lives of meaning, purpose, and connection. Their experiences have informed better approaches to protecting vulnerable individuals in religious communities while respecting the essential freedom of belief and practice. The delicate balance they helped establish continues to guide institutional responses to the complex challenges posed by isolated groups. For researchers, the case provides ongoing insights into genetic inheritance, psychological resilience, and the social dynamics of closed communities. Each generation of survivors and their descendants contributes new understanding of how humans recover from extreme adversity. Perhaps most importantly, the story stands as a reminder of our collective responsibility to remain aware of what happens in society's margins, not through intrusive surveillance, but through maintaining the basic connections that protect the vulnerable and prevent complete isolation. As Eliza Shepard noted in her final published work, the greatest protection against extremism is not aggressive intervention, but persistent connection. When we allow communities to disappear entirely from public awareness, we create spaces where darkness can flourish. Simple threads of connection: a visiting nurse, a rural mail carrier, a traveling teacher. These humble links to the wider world may be all that stands between a closed community and the development of harmful extremes. The forests have reclaimed the valley where the children of Eden once practiced their disturbing theology of blood purity. Nature has erased the physical traces of human suffering that occurred there. But the lessons remain, carried forward by survivors, researchers, and institutions determined to prevent similar tragedies in the future. In the end, the most powerful legacy may be the simplest: the quiet, ordinary lives now lived by descendants of the cult. Children and grandchildren who grow up in open communities, free to make their own choices, their genetic heritage gradually healing with each passing generation. In their freedom lies the ultimate repudiation of the cult's ideology and the most hopeful conclusion to a story that began in darkness. If you've watched all the way to the end, it shows you truly care about understanding these hidden tragedies in American history. Please leave a comment saying, "I watched to the end so I can get to know who truly appreciates these stories on the channel." Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who appreciates learning about the darker chapters of our shared history. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light.